Every single killer in Dead by Daylight has 3 teachable perks that they come with, and today I wanted to choose which of those 3 perks are the best from that killer. Let's try to hit 5,000 likes on this video. Okay, starting off with the Trapper, I'm gonna have to give this to Agitation. I think Agitation is actually very underrated. Being able to hook people faster will save you a lot of time in the long run and can even help you get much more pressure than you would have had otherwise. For example, if you're using a killer with really high snowball potential and you're able to get them to the basement, that can be an absolute game changer. Okay, moving on to Wraith. All of Wraith's perks are absolutely terrible, but honestly, I'm gonna give it to Bloodhound. Shadowborn is an amazing perk just because it looks so good when you're using it, but it really doesn't help that much unless you're like using Nurse or something. But Bloodhound is actually like, it can be useful in, you know, 1 in every 10 games. It makes it much easier to track survivors because their blood will be glowing. So if there's some sort of survivor that's being stealthy or running the new lightweight or running something that gets rid of your scratch marks, you'll be able to see their blood very clearly. It's still not a very good perk though. Okay, moving on to Hillbilly. I'm probably gonna give this to Tinkerer. I honestly haven't used Tinkerer since it was reworked because now it only activates once per gen, which I still think is pretty helpful because most of the time it only activated on the gen once anyway. And it's really good for killers with high mobility that can pressure people off of gens right away. But I think Enduring is a very close second, especially with the recent killer buffs. Moving on to Nurse, I'm gonna say her best perk is Nurse's Calling. I probably would have said Thanatophobia, but it got nerfed. So now it's really only helpful if you have all 4 survivors injured. So that's why I'm giving it to Nurses. I think Nurses is a pretty solid perk. It allows you to see the auras of any survivor that's healing through walls. So it's really good on range killers or stealth killers or even Nurse. For Michael Myers, this is hands down going to save the best for last. Stabiffle is such a good perk right now, especially on that 10% faster cooldown that killers just got, because 10% is essentially 2 stacks of save the best for last. So once you get to the max amount of stacks, which is 8, you basically have the old equivalent of 10 stacks of save the best for last. It is absolutely insane how little distance the survivors get if you have max stacks. I would definitely recommend this perk, especially on killers that have a really easy M2 ability like Pig or Demo. For the Hag, this is obviously going to Devour Hope. Devour Hope has always been one of the strongest perks in the game, and Ruin would have been a close second, but since the recent nerf, Devour Hope is far better. Devour Hope is like Noed mid-game, and it can completely sway the game into your favor. For Doctor, this is a tough one because Overcharge is a pretty good regression perk right now, but I honestly feel like Monitor and Abuse is a little bit better. And hear me out, Monitor and Abuse is much more helpful than you realize while you're in the game. With this perk, you can use it on killers that already have a small terror radius and get an extremely small terror radius, but you can also use it on killers with a large terror radius and pair it with Infectious Fright and be able to have really good snowball potential if you're losing a game. I think there's a ton of applications for this and a ton of perk synergies. Like for example, pairing it with Nurse's Calling, you'll be able to get closer to the survivors that are healing before they even know that you're there. However, Overcharge is still a really solid pick. I just think Monitor is a bit more helpful in more situations. Moving on to Huntress, all of her perks are trash, but Hex Huntress Lullaby is kind of decent. Like it's okay. It just makes skill checks harder the more hooks you get. So it can be good against bad survivors, or it can be good against survivors that are just not paying attention at all. But other than that, it doesn't really do anything. I think the only real application for this is if you're using it with an impossible skill check Doctor build, which makes skill checks actually very scary. Okay, moving on to Bubba, I'm still gonna give this to Barbecue and Chili. Barbecue and Chili allows you to get information that you may not have had otherwise. It can tell you where to go next after you hook somebody, and that is one of the most crucial times to have information on where people are, because after you hook somebody, you're basically not applying pressure to any of the rest of the team. And I feel like Knockout and Franklin's Demise are just very situational perks that aren't totally useful unless you're in those very specific situations. Moving on to Freddy Krueger, I don't honestly know because I don't think I've used a single one of his perks in my 2,000 plus hours of playing this game. I understand what all of them do, but they're all so situational that you can't just choose one. Like if I were to choose one, I'd probably choose Fire Up because you'll get the most value out of that overall because it's just buffing you a little bit throughout the match. But Blood Warden, I feel like can give you much better value, but it doesn't happen as often. So it's kind of like a risk reward scenario. If you want something less strong but less risky, go with Fire Up. But if you want something stronger but more risky, go with Blood Warden. The next killer is the Pig, and I'm gonna give this to Surveillance. Surveillance was way stronger before Ruin got nerfed, but it's still a very good information perk for knowing which gens are being done and which gens are regressing. The only bad thing about this perk is that you do have to pair it with other perks to get any real good value because it activates when gens are regressing, and if you don't have any automatic regression perks, then you have to manually go over to a gen and kick it. But you can pair this with like Ruin or Jolt to get some insane value and to have information on which gens are being done pretty much the entire game. And this combo is very strong on killers that have a lot of mobility. Next up is the Clown, and I'm gonna give this to Bamboozle. I feel like now after understanding the pop nerf a little bit more, it's much more situational than you'd imagine. And I think Bamboozle is just a very solid perk that'll help you throughout the game multiple times. It can make Shack pretty much useless. It can make some of the main building loops pretty much useless. Like it can do a lot for you if you don't have any sort of anti-loop power. I think Bamboozle is very, very underrated. underrated, but the only downside to this perk is if there's a bunch of windows that are connected, Bamboozle won't really help you. Next up is Spirit. I think I'm gonna give the best perk on her to Spirit Fury, simply because the enduring Spirit Fury build is so unbelievably strong. Like, Haunted Ground is a very good perk if you pair it with Retribution and Undying and stuff, but I feel like that's only useful on very specific killers like Deathslinger or Nurse or something, whereas Spirit Fury can be used on pretty much any single killer in the game, and the enduring Spirit Fury build has a really low skill floor but a really high skill ceiling, because once you really understand how it works, you can save it for the good loopers to be able to down them faster and not waste it on the bad loopers that you're already able to down fast. Does that make sense? So it can be really helpful for catching those very strong survivors. Moving on to Legion, I'm going to give this to Discordance. I think Discordance is pretty underrated because it gives you so much information that's really helpful for killer. For one, it tells you that there's two people next to each other, and grouped up survivors is always going to be helpful for you. It also tells you which gen is being worked on, so it tells you if you need to go to a certain gen, and it helps you figure out where the entire team is. Like, if you see someone miss a skill check near Shack and you just hook somebody and then a random gen activates Discordance, then you know exactly where every single survivor on the map is. It is probably one of the best information perks in the game in my opinion. Moving on to Plague, I'm going to give this to Infectious Fright. I think Infectious Fright is severely underrated, but the unfortunate thing about it is it's only really useful if you're a good killer, because to get any value out of it, you have to know how to slug properly. But if you understand how to slug properly and to be able to down people quickly, Infectious Fright can single-handedly win you the game. I've had so many killer games where I'm losing terribly, and because of Infectious Fright, I'm able to slug and build up so much pressure that I 4K. But honestly, Plague's other two perks aren't that bad either. I still think Corrupt Intervention is a very strong perk and could honestly compete with Infectious Fright. I just think Infectious Fright is a little more helpful. Okay, for Ghostface, I'm going to give this to Thrilling Tremors. I think Thrilling Tremors is so good, and it's kind of an alternate perk to Barbecue and Chili, because again, it gives you information on where to go next after you hook a survivor, which is one of the most important times to have information. And it also shows you which gens are being worked on the entire map. So there's not any distance limit like there is with Barbecue. The only downside to Thrilling is that if survivors know you have this perk, they could just let go of the gen when they know you're going to pick up a survivor, and it'll block the gen so you think that there's nobody there, and they'll just continue working on it after it gets blocked, because it doesn't get blocked for that long. For the Demogorgon, this is hands down going to Jolt. Jolt is such a good gen regression perk right now, because all it takes is for you to M1 a survivor, and then pretty much any gen nearby gets blown up and starts to regress. And now with the recent buff, this doesn't have any cooldown. So if you down multiple survivors very quickly, like let's say you have Save the Best for Last and you're able to get a ton of M1s very quickly, you could do so much gen regression. It's also just a passive slowdown perk, and passive slowdown is always going to be helpful compared to manual slowdown. For the Oni, he also has very bad perks, but I'm probably going to give it to Blood Echo. Blood Echo is really the only one that'll give you like real value throughout the game, because when you hook somebody, any other injured survivor becomes exhausted and also suffers from the hemorrhage status effect. And I don't think this is very strong unless you're using like Plague or Legion or something. However, it can actually be surprisingly useful, especially if you track who was affected by Blood Echo when you hook somebody, but it's still a pretty mediocre perk and I'd not recommend using it. For Deathslinger, I'm going to give this to Deadman Switch. Deadman Switch is going to be so good right now because it works with Pain Res again, but it's also just a really good perk by itself if you have killers that can get to gens very quickly, or killers like Artists that can get people off of gens. And it blocks the gen for a really solid amount of time as well, so the survivor's only options are go to a different objective or wait until Deadman Switch runs out. And I doubt they're going to do the latter. All right, Executioner, some of the worst perks in the entire game again, but I think his best one is probably going to Forced Penance, because it makes the survivors suffer if they take protection hits, so it's actually surprisingly good against survivors who know what they're doing. Like, I've seen a lot of killers using this perk in tournaments, but that doesn't mean that this perk is good in casual games, because if the survivors never take protection hits for each other, then you're not going to get any value out of this perk. For Blight, this is hands down going to Undying. Undying gives any Hex Totem an extra life, and it can pair with some of the strongest perk builds in the entire game to make them even stronger. So let's say you have the Haunted Ground Retribution combo. If you put Undying on that, you can get Haunted Grounds to pop twice. Or if you pair Undying with Devour Hope, then you have a much higher chance of actually getting value out of Devour Hope. It's a very strong perk and is one of the most important Hex perks to have. For the Twins, I'm going to give this to Oppression. I actually think this is pretty good right now in this new killer meta, because manual gen regression perks got buffed and Oppression activates when you manually kick a gen. So let's say you're pairing it with like Call of Brian and Overcharge. You'll kick that gen will regress very quickly, and a bunch of other gens will also start to regress. This is a very strong perk in the current meta. For Trickster, I'm going to give this to No Way Out, with Starstruck being a close second. No Way Out just gives you kind of a second chance to redeem yourself in the endgame situation. Plus, it gives you information when somebody touches a door, which is actually pretty helpful. I feel like every time I run this perk, I actually get very good value out of it, and a lot of the times I win because of it. It's just a really good way to build pressure in the endgame. For Nemesis, this one's really hard. I think I'm going to give it to Eruption because of the current gen regression meta. Eruption pairs so well with the meta right now because, again, you have to kick a gen to activate it, so it pairs really well with like Call of Brine and Overcharge and Dragon's Grip and all that. Plus, it got a very good buff. So now if you down a survivor while somebody's working on the gen that you kicked, they won't be able to work on that gen for 25 seconds. Do you know how long that is? 25 seconds of the incapacitated status effect is so strong. You're essentially making a survivor useless for those 25 seconds. Okay, we only have 4 killers left. Before we move on, I just wanted to plug my second Call of Duty Zombies channel. It's just a fun little second channel that I'm doing to kind of branch out into a different game. And I've always been a huge COD Zombies fan, so go check it out. The link is in the description. Okay, for Pinhead, I think I'm going to give this to Deadlock. Deadlock has always been a good perk, but unfortunately, it's even stronger right now because of the slower gen speeds. But it's a really handy slowdown perk because it blocks the most progressed gen for 30 seconds, and 30 seconds is long enough for the survivor to have to go to a different objective. But I do want to give a little honorable mention to Hex Plaything because pairing this perk with Hex Pentimento is one of the strongest perk combinations for killer right now. So I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, for Artist, this is so hard because all of her perks are really good. I think I'm gonna have to give it to Pain Res at this current moment because it'll give you value throughout the entire game, whereas Pentimento, for example, you have to manually go out of your way to get value, and they can undo this value that you make for yourself. But Pain Res is just so good because not only is it passive slowdown, it also can pair with Deadman Switch, which is such a good combination because Pain Res activates Deadman Switch because it knocks everybody off the gen. Okay, for the Onryo, I'm gonna give this to Call of Brine. Right now, Call of Brine is so strong because again, it pairs really well with all of those manual regression perks. Plus, it kind of got an indirect buff with the longer gen speeds. It's just good not only for gen regression, but also to put pressure on the survivors to touch it as soon as possible. And finally, the last killer on this list, the Dredge. I'm gonna give this to Darkness Revealed. Darkness Revealed shows you the auras of any survivors near a locker after you search a locker, so you can essentially get information whenever this perk is active, as long as there's survivors near a locker. I do think that this perk is pretty situational. Like every time I've used it, I haven't gotten that much good value out of it. But again, every time I use this perk, it was on Garden of Joy in the PTB, and that is a very open map with like little to no lockers in the middle, so it wasn't totally useful in that map. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments below.